Very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I'm conscious it's the last talk of the afternoon, so hopefully we'll get you away well before 5. I know you've been talking about quality improvement today, and so I'm going to talk absolutely exclusively about QI and improvement science. And the first thing to say is that I am a real fan of quality improvement. I've never been trained in QI other than a bit of stuff I did when I was doing my MBA, so I'm not an IHI fellow or somebody who's been on, degree courses or CPD type training, but I've become a real fan of QI over the years, and that's a number of reasons, two of which are: one, I really think it drives improvement in patient care, and I think there's an awful lot that we can learn from improvement science in other industries, not all of which is translatable across, but a lot of which is. Into an environment where we tend to, as Emma has described, train in a slightly different approach to evidence and how we apply improvement through evidence. And secondly, because I think it really excites people, and it really drives enthusiasm amongst clinicians and others, because it's not just clinicians in driving that improvement. And I have to say, in the nearly year that I've been in the national job, one of the things that I get to do is to get out every week and go and visit people around the country in all sorts of environments. And people talk a lot about QI. And actually it's when they start to talk about QI that their eyes start to brighten and the lights come on, and they get really excited about what they're doing, whether that's a CCG in Bristol, whether it's a general practice in Liverpool. Wherever I go, I see it bringing people together and making people happy to work, and I think that's really important in the NHS, particularly when the operating pressures, as we know, are always so intense. I'm a real fan of QI. So what I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to go 3 years back, and I'm going to talk mostly about the time before I was National Director. I'll say a little bit at the end about what I think we can do nationally. So usually I'm giving speeches now about national policy and what might be in the long-term plan. Might say a little bit about that at the end, but I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to go back 3 years and talk about my last 2 years at the Royal Free and what I was trying to do with quality improvement there, the lessons I learned from that, and how I've started to take those forward and think about them in the national role. So this is really a story that began, let's say, 3 years ago, actually not long after that quote that Emma put up, when I started to think about, actually it was one of the questions that was asked, how you make quality improvement and continuous improvement the core business of an NHS organisation. So how it goes from discretionary effort that everybody does at 5 o'clock when they're tired doing everything else, a group of enthusiasts that come together, and how you turn that into something that is simply the core business, the way we do things around here. And that's a really radical transformational change for most organisations. I'm not sure that was, convinced it wasn't a transformation that was made by the time I'd left. I think there's a chance that it might come to fruition, but nevertheless I want to take you on the journey and the thoughts that went behind that. So like most things, some of this was serendipity. So 3 years ago, the Royal Free, if I just paint the picture, had expanded in the 2 years previously. It had taken over a neighbouring trust at Barnet and Chase Farm hospitals. It had become a £1 billion organisation with 10,000 staff across 3 main hospital sites. And when that acquisition occurred and the trust expanded, we had designed a clinical model which we thought was fit for purpose, and in fact was fit for purpose at that size of organisation. And in that model we had clinical directors, very clinically led organisation that would lead all the services across all 3 sites. But we got really interested in expanding further, and we got really interested, as some of you might know, in what a group, a chain of hospitals would look like. And so we started to think about whether that operating model, where the clinical director for A&E managed an A&E on 2 different sites and an urgent care centre somewhere else, would really be resilient enough for extending the organisation further. We very rapidly came to the conclusion that it wouldn't, that we would have to change that and go back to a much more site-focused operating model. Now, when we started to discuss that with our clinicians who'd gone through the hard miles over 2 years of bringing together practices across 2 different organisations into a standard set of practices, there was a little bit, we're going back to each site doing things differently. And it very quickly became clear to me that what we needed if we were going to develop a group model, again, it's not particularly rocket science, is some mechanism, some common purpose for everybody who was part of that group to feel that they were part of the group and that they weren't just this site or that site and the other site. So that was very much the thinking that I had in my mind on the background of being a real fan of quality improvement, and at that time we were just about to, actually it turned out, bring IHI in to skill up the staff in all the sort of quality improvement methodology that you've spoken about. Now, the serendipity was that it so happened we had a visit from colleagues from Intermountain Healthcare in Utah, and some of you might know the Intermountain story, but I became a real fan of the way things Intermountain had done things, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. So the reason they came to see us was because they, again, serendipity, were about to implement a completely new electronic patient record across all their hospital sites, and they were about 22 of them, and the EPR was a Cerner system, Cerner Millennium, and as it happened, the Royal Free was on Cerner Millennium as a result of the National IT program 10 years ago. And so they knew that we had an interest in QI, they had an interest in QI, we had an interest in a group model, they ran a group model, we were going to the same EPR, would we like a conversation? And so I began to learn more and more about a story that I knew a bit about, but I hadn't thought about in detail. So Intermountain came into existence, I think, in the 70s, might have been the 60s, 70s, when it was gifted, a set of hospitals were gifted by the Mormon Church to Intermountain, and Intermountain was set up. The church took the view it wasn't in the business of, it was in the business of saving souls, not in the business of saving lives, so it obviously it felt that for one reason or another it couldn't run a set of hospitals, and it handed it over. And it handed over with a mission to Intermountain that the only thing that they needed to do was to ensure that they served the population of Utah and that they were the highest quality, lowest cost system they could possibly be. In fact, if you look at their health outcomes for the amount of money spent, it's very much like European standards rather than you might see in the rest of the United States. So 22 hospitals over, if anybody's been to Salt Lake City, Utah, huge valley, about 200 or 300 miles worth of semi-desert between two mountain ranges, big distances. And in around the 1980s, somebody called Brent James, who again you might have heard of, came back to Intermountain actually because he'd done a bit of training there from Harvard, and he was a surgeon with a surgical oncologist with an interest in clinical trials and statistics. And he came to Intermountain with a real idea that he would take all that expertise and see how he could apply it in a real hospital setting. And although Intermountain has an academic background, it doesn't have the sort of academic background that the Harvards and the Johns Hopkins would have. And so, like many people in QI, he started small. There was a project in the intensive care unit that he got around ECMO at the time and ventilation settings, and they did some improvement work there. Did some work with the urologists, looking at very, very simple stuff that you'd be familiar with. He I think about 12 or 13 urologists. He weighed the tissue, because the weight of the tissue was recorded, presumably by the pathologist. He measured the time that each surgeon took to do the procedure. That was measured in the operating department. And because they had a great financial database, he knew the exact cost for each patient. And you may have seen those wonderful charts that he showed there, where there was no correlation at all between either the time, the amount of tissue that was taken, or the cost to the institution of treating that patient. And he gave all the urologists the data anonymously, and they all said, this can't be right, it's so different. There must be something wrong. They went back to the original notes, they remembered all the patients, so it clearly was right. And then the next round they de-anonymized it. And what happened over time is that they all started to pull out the best practice from each other's practice, because all of them had some best practice, and put that together into a single view of what best practice was. So that was the sort of work that was going on in Intermountain. It's probably very familiar with the sort of work we were certainly doing at the Royal Free. So for many years we at the Royal Free had got improvement methodology in sepsis around the Sepsis 6 programme, and we got lots of iterations and we rolled it out to a few wards but not to the whole hospital. And there were lots of other little projects like that. But this work started to get some impetus at Intermountain, and around the mid-1990s the board of Intermountain had what I think was their major light bulb moment, and they pulled Brent and his colleagues in and they said, what you're doing is really great, it's really fantastic, but actually it's too small scale, it's discretionary effort, it's not occurring at all our 22 hospital sites. Go away and come back with an operating model for this organisation that means it's just business as usual. Go away and design something so it's done at all sites, it's done part of core business, and it spreads rapidly. And that's really what they did in the 1990s, and for the last 20 years have been working on that basis. And I won't go into the detail, but they set a whole lot of permanent structures up, led by clinicians whose role it was to understand their practice, their key processes, and then using continuous improvement to work out what best practice was, to monitor that, and using continuous improvement loops to drive improvement. And they very quickly recognised, I think, that about 80 to 100 key processes that they did. Actually, those key processes won't be very different from our key processes in any of our healthcare organisations, particularly hospitals. So I reckon at the Royal Free, childbirth was probably our commonest process, probably about 13,000 of those a year. So that won't be very different. And understanding your key processes and which ones you need to focus on. They focused on the ones that were highest risk, where they knew there was variation, because they're very interested in getting rid of unwarranted variation as part of the continuous improvement cycles. They wanted to work in areas where they knew they had a clinical leadership team who was up for doing something different, although over time, of course, everybody was up for doing it. So a whole lot of criteria by which they set about doing this. And by the mid-2000s, they could show you lots and lots of standardized processes driven by continuous improvement loops. And if you ask the people at Intermountain the question, which I asked, that, you know, in your heart attack pathway, how many times do people deviate from that? They will say it's used 93% of the time. They won't give you a qualitative answer, they give you a quantitative answer, because they measure it. And then say, if we see people are using this pathway 100% of the time, we get really worried about it, because it means doctors and clinicians have switched their brains off. Because you can't possibly have a guideline that is used 100% of the time. It will never perfectly fit every patient. If it's used 60% of the time, then usually our first thought is we've got the guideline wrong. Because actually, if our clinicians aren't using it, they're all experts. If they're not using it or a part of it, they're using a different drug to the one we recommend, then we've probably got it wrong, rather than they're not implementing the guideline. So a much better use of data and much better understanding. And their only punishment of clinicians who didn't follow the guidance was you had to write down why you deviated from it, because that's what feeds the continuous improvement loops. If you know why people aren't doing something, then you can feed that back into a continuous improvement loop. So they had got to the point where they were digitizing all those processes into Cerner, into their electronic patient record, and that was back to the point at which they came to see us. So we paid a few visits to Intermountain, we saw their quality improvement work, we spoke to Brent, they have a QI academy there, so they link in a great use of data with great skills and quality improvement, with permanent structures and a clinical leadership around those clinical pathways. And so what we tried to do is to compress all of that 20 or 30 years of learning into probably a 5-year program at the Royal Free, which I managed the first 2 years. And so we devised permanent structures at Royal Free called clinical practice groups that are up and running. They've been up and running for about 18 months, bringing together, led by clinicians, but bringing together clinicians, managers, analysts, finance teams, QI experts together to map out our key processes, decide what best practice is, and then to implement best practice. And because, back to the digitization, because we were about to upgrade our Cerner system, the ability to digitize those as part of digital workflows. And again, this is not really clever stuff, it's just clever implementation of stuff. So if you want your docs or your nurses to use a recommended drug, then make it easy for them to use that by using electronic prescribing to throw up the right drug. They want to use another drug, they can pick another drug, just write down and say why you've used that other drug, because then that's in the quality improvement feedback loop. So, a few observations on that at the Free. Firstly, back to what I said at the start, once we got those groups together, actually it really sparked something different. And actually getting all those people in a room and giving them a bunch of data, including the national audits, to use as inputs into what best practice should be was a really exhilarating set of experiences. And although I've left, I know over the last year that they have designed those processes and they've started to put them into practice. The one that I heard presented the other week was the neonatal pathway. It's a pathway around admitting people into the neonatal units, and they told me by using that standardised practice, they've cut the admissions to the neonatal unit by about 50%, just by taking out unwarranted variation and consistently implementing best practice on a QI methodology basis. So I don't know whether that experiment will succeed, but I hope it does. And what I said at the start was really actually what I was trying to do there, which was to change the operating model of the organisation so that that sort of QI methodology is just the core business of how you design things and how you do things. You design best practice, you implement it, because actually we're great at designing the inputs into best practice, the guidelines, the audits, but then actually implementing it so that it's the easiest thing for our staff to do on a regular basis, and then using the output from that as a QI loop to drive further improvements is what we need to get better at. So to the question of how do you get people doing this and how do you give them the training, well actually my answer would be you embed it in core business. It becomes the way you do it, and not a hobby on the side, which too often in the past QI, I'm afraid, has been seen as a hobby on the side. So how does that translate into what we could do nationally? And so I think there's a few lessons for me in that. I don't think you can go into any of the organisations that we work for, or any of the organisations that aren't here, whether it's a general practice, a mental health trust, an integrated care system, or an acute trust, and say we want you to do QI, because it just won't work. They may be doing some QI, but if you get them to do more QI, it will fall on fallow ground unless there's a certain set of things present, in my view. So one of them is an organisational leadership that really buys into this, because actually if your board doesn't buy into it, if your senior leaders don't buy into it, then you will struggle to do it. So one of the tasks we have to do collectively is to ensure that our senior leaders and our boards are really passionate and clear about the benefits of QI. Secondly, you need great clinical leadership, because it absolutely takes clinicians to do this. They can't do it on their own. It is a team effort, but if the clinicians aren't engaged in this, then it's not going to happen, which is why the sort of stuff that Emma's doing to generate a cadre of clinicians who are passionate about this is really important. And it's not just doctors, of course, it's all, so when I use the word clinician, I don't mean doctors, I mean clinicians in the round. That's the second thing. Thirdly, you need some training and some methodology. You need to pick your methodology. I don't really care what methodology it is. It could be the PDSA cycles, it could be lean, it could be, that's not the point. The point is you have a methodology, and you do have to train your staff and give people skills, and people need different sets of skills. So at the Royal Free, we did that, as I said, by bringing in the IHI in a formal training program, formal partnership. Other organisations have done have used other methods, but you do need to do that. Fourthly, I think you need, I think digital is a real enabler here, because some of the outputs and some of the implementation of QI, I think, will really be accelerated by implementation of digital systems. So in my world, or in my mind, the reason to digitise the NHS is not to replace paper. That has value in it, but actually it doesn't set people's, boats afloat. We need to use digital to actually improve care for staff and improve care for patients and processes for staff. So when electronic prescribing becomes a way of reducing errors and allowing people to choose the drug that's in the guideline, it's a much better implementation than if it just replaces paper. And we need to create the time, which is back to making it the core business. So it's absolutely right. So even at the Royal Free, about this time of year, a year ago, we would be having the debate as whether we could release people to do that design work, or whether we needed to put them into A&E, because A&E was under pressure because it was December and January. And those are really live conversations with the key leaders in the various sites that we had, who are juggling two things. They're juggling a view of the 3 or 4 years' time when we will see the benefits of a lot of this work versus what's happening in A&E tomorrow. And you all live that every day, but we need to be able to hold both of those. So what can we do nationally to help with that? So a few final words on national. So we mentioned NHS improvement, and NHS improvement has improvement in its title, but I think the NHS improvement would be the first organisation to say that they have come from a regulator background and they have not necessarily moved completely towards an improvement background. And I'm absolutely convinced that NHS Improvement wishes to do that at senior leadership. So I'm now, about to become part of senior leadership at NHS Improvement because I've just been appointed to the medical director job as NHSI and NHS England. So there is a real momentum in NHS Improvement to move towards an improvement function. As part of that redesign, there is a new improvement directorate that is being created at NHS Improvement. Chief Improvement Officer will be announced soon, and I think that Improvement Directorate needs to become the engine nationally for working with organisations to drive quality improvement and to support quality improvement. The national audits, and of which NCPOD is part, are a great part of the inputs and the outputs of improvement work. And so the work that NCPOD does and all our other national audits is really key, as are other things such as the GIRF programs, and you've heard from GIRF this morning, and other inputs that we have nationally where we collect data. So we absolutely need to continue on the journey that we've got around making sure our audits are fit for purpose, they are supporting our staff in taking that data and then driving into improvement cycles. And of course with that we need to make sure that we recognise that audit is one part of the improvement cycle. I'm sure like you will all have seen presentations, as I did at the Royal Free, where somebody presents the results of this year's audit and compares it with last year's audit, and you ask the question, what have you done in between the two audits? Well, we collected the data for the next audit. And simply collecting the data for the next audit is not going to change what's in the results of the audit. And in fact, one of the very last things that happened to Royal Free before I left, not a national audit, but local audits, some of our team said, we are not going to do any more audits until we've got the improvement methodology in place so that we're confident that when we audit next time, we will have done something that will have driven a change. Now, I wouldn't probably have stopped the audit bit, but the message was clear. We understand that this is not about collecting data, this is about taking data and improving. So one of the things I also do is co-chair the National Quality Board. We have just set up a subgroup of the National Quality Board. I co-chair it with Ted Baker, the Chief Inspector of Hospitals, to support HQIP and the national audits in ensuring that our audits are the right audits, and that the data that we're getting from the audits are the data that we need collectively to drive improvement. And then clinical leadership is the third thing that I'll just say nationally. So I'm as much a fan of clinical leadership as I am of improvement, and as I said, I think you need both. So as we develop integrated care systems and we start to think about joined up pathways of care between primary care and secondary care, social care, mental health, we need our clinical leaders to step up, to come out of organisational silos and to work collaboratively across those systems. And in doing that and designing new pathways of care, quality improvement needs to be at the heart of those systems. So I'm really keen that as we drive further forward on that you in this room and others step up locally and put quality improvement at the heart of those integrated care systems. And there are a number of integrated care systems that I know are already doing that. So Surrey Heartlands, I was at their QI day a few weeks ago, and there's some great stuff coming out of the work that's being done there. So this is happening and we need to do more of it. And then finally on the curriculum, so you're absolutely right, we can't expect people to just know this. And there's a number of things in medical curricula and other curricula that we need to prepare our doctors for, so that they're fit for the 2020s and 2030s, and it's not just doctors, of which QI and QI methodology is one. So I'm very keen that we continue the conversation around ensuring that as our curricula and our learning methodologies and learning environments develop, that QI is one of the skills that we ensure that our clinicians of the future know about and learn about and have a skill base in as much as they have in anatomy and physiology. So I sometimes say, when I'm being really mischievous, that I can probably still just about remember the brachial plexus from when I was at medical school in the 1970s. I don't use it, but I could probably draw it in the Krebs cycle, but I can't remember being ever taught anything about QI or patient safety or risk. And actually that's what we need to equip our clinicians of the future with, because that is just as important as what we traditionally equip them with. So on that note, I think I'm going to finish. I'm very happy to take questions. Oh, I did say I'd say something about the long-term plan, didn't I? So the long-term plan is about to be published. When it gets published is a little bit contingent upon other things that are happening in government at the moment, but probably, well, where are we, Tuesday, so possibly this week, but certainly in the new year, the long-term plan will be published. I think as that long-term plan is there, so I'm hopeful there will be some QI in the long-term plan, and as the long-term plan gets implemented and interpreted into local healthcare systems, we need in that interpretation quality improvement to be the methodology that drives forward many of the initiatives that you will see in the long-term plan. And as a national leader, that's one of my aims with my colleagues at NHS England, NHS Improvement, to make sure that happens. And my very last plug is Aidan Fowler, who's a national patient safety director, published his draft patient safety strategy, probably yesterday or today. And continuous improvement is part of the underpinning of that strategy. So for those of you in the room that want to have a look at that, have a look at it. By all means, I've already given him some feedback. Give him some feedback in terms of how you want continuous improvement, QI and audit to be at the heart of the patient safety strategy. Okay, so with that, I really am going to shut up. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you.